Hello, Tansei Anine. Good afternoon. Welcome to APTN InFocus. I'm Daryl Stranger. Today, we're again putting missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in focus, and the Sisters in Spirit marches that happen around this time of year. And as always, we want you to join in on our conversation today. You can tweet us at APTN InFocus, or you can email infocus@aptn.ca. Well, let's just get right into this important conversation and welcome our first guest here. And our first guest is actually joining us in studio, and it's Cambria Harris. Harris has been at the forefront of calling for more action and resources in the search for her mother and Mercedes Myron here in Winnipeg. So Cambria, thank you so much for joining us here. We really appreciate your time. Thank you. So I guess we last spoke with you just before Christmas, right? So it's been a few months. What's the last few months been like for you and your family and everybody else involved?
Well, the last time we spoke would have been right when I came back from Ottawa after I had spoken in Parliament, and immediately after that, December 13th, 15th, and 17th, I believe, is when we did blockades at the Brady landfill, and December 18th was when we set up a permanent blockade in protest to what's going on to our Indigenous women, and it's been set up for about 64 days now, and we have a sacred fire going. We're looking at getting a teepee and some ceremony happening. And it's really just really been insane with what's been going down in camp and keeping the awareness going and such.
Mm-hmm. So what are you actively doing now then? What's the current situation look like?
The current situation is we're trying to get camp back up because just last week we had that really, really bad storm. And so it was like minus 35 with the winds and the temperatures, and Camp Morgan, which is named after my mother who was murdered, got torn away and blown away by the wind. So that's thousands and thousands of dollars that we had put into it just gone by the snap of the weather, really. And that's been our biggest challenge, is just getting people out there and stuff, and getting people to understand why we're out at the Brady landfill and not the Prairie Green, because people don't understand that. Mm-hmm.
Well, can you remind our viewers again why you are there, just for those that might have forgot or haven't known?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, there's a feasibility study going on right now for the Prairie Green landfill where the remains are believed to be. But we're protesting at the Brady landfill because there's not a feasibility study currently being done on the Brady. And they're only going to propose a feasibility study of the Brady landfill if the remains aren't found in the prairie, when I think it should be done immediately. So that's really what it is, because we believe that there's more remains there than just 2 women, just given the timelines and stuff and GPS tracking when it was installed. And
yeah. Well, you had mentioned the feasibility study. So there is a feasibility study, and there was $500,000 announced from the federal government. What were your thoughts on that when that was announced just a few weeks ago?
Well, I'm very, very grateful that they're going to be funding that feasibility study. We still have to request funding for the actual search, and given that they are giving $500,000 to fund the feasibility study, and our blockade supposedly cost the city, at first it was $400,000, and then now it's $900,000 that they're saying we cost them. So really, the city could have just paid for that search, and it was never about feasibility. It was just that they didn't want to pay for it. And sometimes you got to go to extreme measures in order to get the people's attention, and just to bring my mom home and these other women and give them peace.
So, Cambria, what do you think can be learned from the situation that's going on here in Winnipeg that maybe can be applied in a future situation where something like this happens again?
Well, I want to see immediate next steps, and starting to involve the grassroots organizations and the victims' families that were impacted by this. When you go and you make decisions such as the feasibility study under the table back in June, and then make the decision that you're not going to search, and then provide no alternative routes for the family, then of course the family's not going to be happy. So I would like to see more involvement and more truth between parties, and just communication and having those conversations, and just treating each other as basic human beings and not above or below each other, I guess, which is how it's been feeling. It's been feeling very, I guess you can say, dictatorial in what's been going on.
Well, you mentioned the grassroots organizations, and we need the federal and the provincial governments and the funding to be able to do these. But how important are these grassroots organizations and the people that are volunteering their time to do things like the blockade and searching?
Yeah, so it doesn't only come just from blockades and searching. Our grassroots organizations are who help our people struggling in the streets, outreach workers, needle prevention and stuff like that, handing out stuff to prevent overdoses, just handing out food for the community. Grassroots organizations are a big part of giving the community a voice when people strip them of their voices. And a perfect example, I guess, would be the NWAC 7 Steps to the Federal Government on looking into the ongoing crisis of MMIWG, and one of them was involving grassroots organizations and the victims' families, which is so simple, and none of which of that has been done.
Yeah. Well, jumping back to the feasibility study here a little bit, with the feasibility study, what's sort of next here in the near future? Can you share with our audience sort of what are some of the next steps here with this feasibility study?
Yeah. So a lot of people seem to not understand why we aren't able to just go in and start searching right now.
Right.
We can't because it's city property. If we go in, we would immediately get arrested. That's not the way to go about things. So I'm protesting legally. I'm not doing anything wrong. And the next steps would be the feasibility study, which is expected to take until the end of March, early March, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it was the end of March, yeah. And then we got to request the funding for the search, and a lot of people seem to be thinking that it's the police who are going to be searching and it's going to be the public and stuff, but I don't believe that's the case. They're going to have people who actually know what they're doing with the landfill, because the way these landfills work, there's a lot of steps and the way they work, and they compact it, they cover them with clay and stuff after to prevent the fumes from getting out, and then they got to start new cells as well when these searches happen, so that trash isn't dumped on human remains.
Right.
Yeah.
And so just going back a little bit, you had said you're also looking at doing something similar to the Brady Road landfill, right? Regardless of what happens I just want to make sure that's what...
Yeah, that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting to get a feasibility study done on the Brady landfill, just because it's not only about my mother, Morgan Harris, anymore. It's about Buffalo woman as well. And if you look back at the timelines, and she was murdered back in March, as much as I hate to say it, that would be underneath where remains are found previously. And they haven't provided any reasoning as to why they don't believe she's in there, or why they don't know where her remains are, and other women as well. It's a lot of information to just give out, you know what I mean?
No, absolutely. And with this time of year, and the Sisters in Spirit marches happen across the country. There's many marches that are going on this time of year. Why are things like these marches and these rallies so important to still be had?
Because it's about giving back voices to the voiceless, to the women whose lives were mercilessly taken away and stolen at the expense of, quite frankly, monsters and people who don't even deserve that acknowledgement. And we're stronger in numbers, and when we're together as a community, we can turn it into something beautiful. You can grieve in a million different ways, and you can be really, really angry and hurt at the world, or you can actually go out and do something. As condescending as that sounds, you can. You can do much greater things, like going out and doing these walks and bringing the awareness, because we're going missing every single day, and us getting together is a message that we're still here and we're not going anywhere and we're not backing down. Every march you see, they just get bigger and bigger, and the cries of our women get louder and louder.
Well, Cambria, that's really well said. I think that's a good way to maybe put a pause on this conversation for now. I know this is an issue that's going to be long-standing still, and we certainly appreciate you coming in and sharing a bit of your insight and sort of what's going on. And I'm sure this won't be the last time we have a conversation like this. So thank you so much for coming in and joining us, and again, sharing a bit of your knowledge and what's going on. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, and joining us now is Marion Buller, who was the Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Ms. Buller, thank you so much for joining us here today on APTN InFocus. We're a few years removed now from the final report and the 231 calls for justice. First off, my first question for you is have you seen any change over the last few years here?
Oh, thank you, first of all, for inviting me today to talk about this important topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. Have I seen progress? Well, in some respects, yes. In the North, Yukon Territory, NWT, they have developed their own responses to our report and are actually making change. Elsewhere across Canada, perhaps not as organized or as easily accessed, but there is change. The federal government now has at least advertised for the position of Deputy Commissioner for Corrections regarding Indigenous people. I'm not too sure exactly what the job title is, but I know they're looking to hire somebody. And also, I think it's starting this week, there'll be a ministerial secretary assisting in establishing our call for justice that involves Indigenous and Human Rights Tribunal, as well as an Indigenous ombudsperson. So there is change. However, Indigenous women and girls and 2S people are still going missing and are still being murdered.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is the situation, the recent situation here in Winnipeg where 4 Indigenous women were killed, and there's the possibility of a search of a landfill for 2 Indigenous women who are suspected to be there. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and maybe what you make of the whole situation.
Well, thank you. I think it's a very sad situation in Winnipeg, and my heart goes out to the family and friends of all of the women who have been murdered and whose remains are yet to be found. I think there's an important lesson to be learned from not too far down the road from me, the Picton farm here in British Columbia. At one point, the police brought in forensic archaeologists who actually were able to do an amazing job of finding human remains in very trying circumstances in terms of physical surroundings. The actual site itself was a very difficult site to work. And so I think that there are lessons to be learned about how to manage this type of search, who should do it, how long it might take, the resources needed, just by, first of all, looking at the Picton farm and how that was excavated. And also, I know technology has changed since that excavation was done. I guess it would be 8 or 9 years ago now, or even more, so that there'll be improvements in technology as well for excavating. And it has to be done. Those women's remains simply have to be found. They can't be considered garbage.
And you mentioned of what could be learned. I was also, that's sort of my next question, is what could be learned from previous situations, as well as the situation here in Winnipeg, both what to do in the situation, but maybe also how to handle the situation as well.
Yes, it's not only going and excavating the site, it's also how do you do it properly in ceremony, in supporting the families and in supporting the people who are doing the work too. It's very, very difficult work. And so I think a lot could be learned about what was done at the Picton farm and what wasn't done. And the work has to be done in the right way for everybody's sake.
And Ms. Buller, why are things like walks and rallies and movements that show support so important? I know that's something that happens pretty regularly, and it's really important they happen, but why is it that they're so important that they continue to happen?
You know, the rallies, the walks, the demonstrations, the workshops are all critically important to keeping this issue in the public eye and reminding politicians that there has to be change, that they have to be working diligently on our calls for justice. So very important. They keep things in the public eye, and they get interest like APTN's interest. So it keeps everything in public view and on the agenda, so to speak.
And how specifically do they keep the issue on the agenda of what they're trying to go for and aim for, excuse me?
Well, vigils, walks, demonstrations, workshops, they're all very visible. And they're all very in the moment, in time. Social media picks them up immediately, well, even before they even start. And so they're reminding us, all of us, about the importance of the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, and how the genocide has to stop. And the commissioners and myself set out many different options for stopping that genocide. We just simply have to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Ms. Buller, what needs to be done moving forward? I mean, in your experience and expertise, you've done quite a number of things in your experience. What needs to be done here as we move forward?
Well, what we have to do moving forward is really work very diligently on systemic change, changing the systems, decolonizing systems. And by that, I mean decolonizing the child welfare system. It's certainly a good start with First Nations across Canada being able to reclaim their children, our children, and have jurisdiction over their own children, which I just find is a bit of an oxymoron. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But not only to take back their own children, but to have the resources to do it properly and in a good way for the children and their families and for the community. And by decolonizing systems, I also mean decolonizing the justice system, not just the criminal justice system, but family. As well, family courts. Let's decolonize those. Let's get the power back in the hands of Indigenous people as opposed to the colonial governments. Let's make sure that Indigenous governments are properly resourced so that they can take back, rather than just trading off and saying, well, here you go, First Nation, we're acknowledging you have jurisdiction over your own children, but we're not going to resource this for you. So there are a lot of systems that have to change, that have to decolonize. And I think we have to, all of us, all Canadians, have to move forward on taking one system at a time and decolonizing it.
And Ms. Buller, just one final question for you here. The inquiry heard many allegations of RCMP officers sexually assaulting Indigenous women and girls. Now, one of those accounts is actually on paper as part of an RCMP complaint investigation in Prince George. What do you think should be done about it?
Well, first of all, I think the report should be made public so that everyone has access to the same information. I think that's first and foremost. And I think the next step, once it's made public, is for the RCMP to take ownership. I think it's very tragic, but very typical, that the women aren't believed until a white man says it's so. Because those women have been telling their stories for many, many years, and no one believed them. And so now that a white man has said it's been happening, people believe it. And that's so misogynistic, that's so racist, that's so sexist, when women have been saying this all along and nobody has believed them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ms. Buller, certainly a lot to think about and a lot to, think about moving forward here as we continue. But I want to say thank you, and we certainly appreciate your time and your insight into this issue. And it's one that certainly won't be going away anytime soon. So we'll certainly be watching it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we have to step aside for a moment. We'll have plenty more talk when we return.
Join our conversation now. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page, follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus, and send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Thousands took to the streets of Vancouver at the 32nd annual Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls March last week. As APTN's Tina House reports, missing and murdered cases keep rising despite these marches and a national inquiry.
Indigenous women, I'm sick and tired. All the people today are sick and tired. It's not politically correct to say it, but if you want to get away with murder, you kill an Indian because we don't get justice. We need justice now!
As the only Indigenous person in the BC legislature, NDP Minister Melanie Mark could not hold back her anger and frustration as cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls continue to rise across Canada, despite a national inquiry. Close to 5,000 people made the somber walk, singing songs as they went and stopping in certain places along the route to place flowers where many women were found murdered. Suit Lute's daughter, Cassandra Antone, is one of those cases. Antone was just 20 years old and the mother of a 5-month-old baby when her burnt remains were found in Richmond, BC in 1997.
I used to come down here and look for her on the downtown east side because I am a day school student and I didn't get to see my daughter heal. I healed, but I never got to see her heal. And our people need to heal. The only way we'll heal is in our custom and traditions, our language, and remembering who we are.
Melody Casella's late cousin, Cheryl Ann Joe, was the mother of 3 young boys when she was tragically murdered on the downtown east side in 1992. Her death inspired this march, now in its 32nd year.
We have the 231 calls for justice of the national inquiry that have yet to be fully acknowledged by the federal government. And here we stand again with AFN to hold the government accountable in hopes that something will be done, so there will be acknowledgement and something done about the systemic violence against Indigenous women and girls.
And Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations Vice Chief Ali Bear says the government has to do more.
We need funding that's specific to MMIWG2S+, because we need prevention, and we also need healing for our families, and we also need access to justice. Most of the time, you know, it's so confusing to navigate the legal system, to navigate the police, the investigators, to even try to get an interview with them.
And for Marlene Jack, whose sister Doreen, her husband Russell, and their 2 young boys disappeared without a trace in 1989. She says the police failed her and her family.
You know, they already told me I won't get justice for my family. I had, after we did our search in Stony Creek in 2019, after the search, a month later, the officer that did the investigation at that time phoned me and actually told me, you might as well just give up, don't bother the police anymore, don't look for them, because it's a lost cause right at this point with these so many years gone by.
You know, my daughter was stabbed multiple times in the stomach. Guy bit off her ear, gave her a hairline fracture. They had to do a life-saving emergency and put her on life support. Was there justice for her? No. The guy got off scot-free. He didn't get charged for anything. When you talk about the roots of what our Indigenous women deal with, that's our reality.
Sheila Poorman's late daughter Chelsea went missing in 2020, and her remains were later found outside of an abandoned mansion on Vancouver's west side 2 years later.
We still don't have an answer as to what happened to her. So if anybody knows anything, I just ask them to, you know, call the Vancouver police and let them know. They could stay anonymous too.
And so for the last 32 years, this march and all the people here gathered today are demanding answers. What happened to so many of the murdered missing Indigenous women and girls across Canada?
Our next guest here on InFocus is the president of the Native Women's Association of Canada, Carol McBride. She joins us to talk about what is being done across the country and what still needs to be done to address MMIWG. Carol, thank you so much for joining us here today. We'll start with your role as president. You've been in the role for about 7 months or so. Is there anything that has surprised you to learn in your time as president so far?
Well, there's quite a few things that really has shocked me. I guess on the slow moving of the government on different. Meanwhile, our women and our families are suffering out there. Like take for instance the housing. The housing and the shelters, it's moving way too slow. In the meantime, our families are living in violent situations, and they need somewhere to go. And that's one of the things that has shocked me. The other thing is how discrimination is still alive and well, and it's horrible. I always thought that we were so lucky living in Canada, but when you still see the prejudices and the discrimination, and there's still a lot of work to do. And those are some of the things that really hit me. And also the healing that has to take place with the decolonization. There's just so much that has to be done in terms of that. And, finding our ancestors' bodies, like children, residential school. It just, it just brings me to think on how strong of people we are, that we were able to come out of this and But now that, some of these things have passed, we're still living with the healing part. And that is what we really need right now.
Well, and Carol, in your January President's Report, you had said appointing Jennifer Moore-Rattray to the role of a ministerial special representative, where she'll be tasked with providing recommendations for the creation of an Indigenous and human rights ombudsperson. Now, you said that was a step in the right direction, but you'll be monitoring timelines. What exactly will you be watching for?
Well, I'll definitely be watching for, specific, let's say, infrastructure on how she's going to deal with all the issues that is really outstanding. I figure we're majorly slow at, this appointment of someone, an ombudsman, and this is really, really needed. And, we just gotta let her have a chance to get situated. And then I'm hoping that we see some positive results coming forward, because that, it's just really, really taking too long. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, our like going back to our women and our families, they're suffering.
And Carol, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the situation, the recent situation here in Winnipeg, where 4 Indigenous women were killed, and there's the possibility of a search of a landfill for 2 Indigenous women. I was just wanting to get your thoughts on that situation.
Well, unfortunately, it's a very, very, very sad situation. I met the girls in December at the AFN meeting, and my heart goes out to them. And yes, there's 4 bodies that they found 3. 1 is still to be found. But how many other of our people are missing? And I'm thinking about children. What about the kids that have been buried, and the files are there and they won't give it to us? Like, this really boggles my mind. Like, how can they do that? I mean, they've done enough harm on our people, and then keeping that type of information is just, it doesn't make no sense to me. But going back to these unfortunate families, my goodness, they must be suffering. My heart really, really goes out to them. And and we will be, and have experienced so much grief. It's like I said, we are strong people.
Mm-hmm. And Carol, what can maybe be learned by the situation here in Winnipeg, and not only Winnipeg, but across the country with all types of situations like this? What can be learned from that?
Well, for me, it's a lesson that we're not, that there's so much that has happened to our people. And, we built, by those experiences, for me, we built a lot of our strength, a lot of knowledge on what has gone on with our people across this country. And it's mind-boggling on some of the horrible stories that you hear across this nation. You would never think that we lived in something so grave, like going back to the missing children. I know, being a mother and a grandmother, I just can't think on how horrible that would be if I didn't know where my grandchild's body was, or what happened to them when they were taken away from us. It's just horrible.
Mm-hmm. And Carol, there's many things like walks and rallies and movements at all times of the year. Why are things like that so important and that show support in that way?
Well, number one that I feel is that it brings the story out. It brings the what's happening to the public, and so that they can understand and they can help with supporting our people. I think a lot of things have been brought out in the public right now, and I think that awareness is really softening the Canadian citizens across this country to understand how terrible Indigenous people have been treated, and how far we still have to go and that we do have needs right now that needs to be looked at. I know for NWAC, we have the Sisters in Spirits. That is a very powerful October 4th date that we come together with people, our families that have experienced the loss, and we remember the women that have passed on, and also the logo of Sisters Spirit. It means a lot to me because what is Grandmother Moon? Grandmother Moon is something very, very powerful, and gives us direction and wisdom and the knowledge, to keep on going, and that the family circle is very important, and that we've got to keep that strength up. So I think NWAC has done a great job I think it's in existence for about 19 years now, and I think the numbers of violence against our women has grown. So it's exactly what is needed to bring us together and to support one another.
Well, it's really well said, Carol, and I just wanted to ask about the inquiry as well. So we've had the inquiry, it's a few years removed now. How is the government doing in terms of implementing those recommendations?
Well, as you know, NWAC has provided a report card, two report cards, in fact, one of the Canadian government and one of our own. And by far, NWAC is doing a great job in fulfilling some of the recommendations. The government, not so much, and I'm hoping that picks up, especially with the ombudsman that will hopefully, push these files. That definitely needs a pushing at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, just on that note, Carol, last one for you here. What can be done as we move forward here?
Well, I think what needs to happen is that women and families across this country needs to be listened to. Their voice needs to be heard. And hopefully with this ombudsman, we're going to be able to pass on the voices of our women that are not here, maybe, that are, that have passed on by violence and whatever, and hopefully to bring forward some really, really strong supports for our people, healing lodges. Our people really need these healing places, and our women that have been incarcerated. That's very alarming. I mean, our people, I think we make up maybe 5% of the total population, but in federal prisons, we're experiencing 50% of that of our women that are being incarcerated. I think a lot of work has to be done there, but it's we have our work cut out for us, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you said, Carol, a lot of work certainly needs to be done, and it's something that we will be keeping an eye on as that work happens. We really appreciate the time, and thank you so much for joining us for a few minutes today and sharing your thoughts and insight.
Well, thank you very much for taking the interest in what NWAC is doing. Thank you.
All right, it's that time for one final break here on our show. We'll have more in focus in just a few minutes. Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Love filled downtown Winnipeg on Valentine's Day as over 200 people marched during a bit of a snowstorm to remember their loved ones. APTN's Leanne Sanders has the story.
They gathered in memory of Winnipeg's missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people whose lives were taken in a violent epidemic sweeping Turtle Island.
Especially for those who have lost ones in the past or are still missing, it's us to show that we as women are resilient, and though we are hurt, we are still here, and we're going to be aware, and we're going to be proud and loud.
Organizer Anna Heward says the large turnout for an event during a snowstorm is indicative of how important these memorial marches are.
It shows that we're strong and resilient, and that despite some unlikely conditions happening, that we're still gonna show up for each other, no matter what.
Candace Voke lost her daughter to murder just over 2 years ago, and her son soon after. Despite the blizzard and below -20 wind chill, she says nothing could stop her from marching for them.
How cold I get, I think of some of the girls whose bodies were found in winter and how cold they must have been. So to be cold for a few minutes in their memory and honor is nothing.
Though there were many tears, laughter could be heard throughout the crowd as marchers found community in one another.
I feel safe here because they know what we're going through, a lot of families. We all belong to this club that I don't ever want anyone to belong to.
Our final guest on today's show is Hilda Anderson-Piers. She's an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, and she joins us now. Hilda, thanks so much for joining us here on APTN InFocus. So we're looking at the annual day to honor MMIWG2S and their families and the marches and rallies that happen this time of year. You're not just an advocate, but also a family member. What are you thinking about this time of year?
I think, for me, I'm honoring and remember all those, that we've lost tragically to homicide. And, for those who are missing, we're carrying them in our hearts during this time. But also to really amplify the need for action, so that we can put an end to this national crisis that is, continuing, and numbers are going up at alarming rates. So it's a day of, for me, it's a day of remembering and honoring, but also a day for calling for action.
Now, Hilda, how have you been able to turn your frustration and maybe anger into action?
I think, for me, turning my frustration and anger, on the tragic loss of my sister and, my niece and my cousin as well, is to really amplify their voices, and to know that their voices have not been silenced, and to really focus on, the systemic and structural failures that have contributed to the loss of human lives, especially Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, and to focus on accountability, but also to focus on prevention, on what does prevention look like, what could ultimately save the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, and what does that look like, and to ensure that the voices of grassroots people are central in the process, the ones who are being directly impacted on a daily basis, to ensure that their voices are included and central, and to navigate spaces and opportunities for that to occur. So for me, and that's how I've turned my anger and frustration into, to moving forward and healing, as well as to know that I'm doing my part as someone who's directly impacted, to create pathways for safety and security. And for, and standing in my truth as well, if we can't truth tell, a lot is not going to change. So it's really critical that, we stand in our truth as advocates championing change.
And Hilda, I had mentioned there's all these important marches and memorials and rallies being held. Why is it still very important that these are held to honor this day?
It's a significant reminder to Canada and to institutions, agencies, and all Canadians that, that this is real, this is ongoing, this is a national crisis, and we need to respond and respond adequately. It's fine to attend the marches, but families and survivors and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people are exhausted from fighting a fight for survival and for safety. It's time that all Canadians and all governments take action, and to ensure that action, if we feel the impact on the ground, and that there's accountability for any funding that is going out to organizations who are providing those supports and those resources, and that those organizations are safe, they're safe for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people to access supports and resources. This is why it's critical that any organization who is providing supports and resources for impacted family members and survivors of gender-based violence are independent and not governed under any political structures.
Well, and Hilda, we're 4 years past the national inquiry now, or it's been almost 4 years, I guess, this year. How has the progress been in your view?
I think, like, in my view, in my advocate hat, but also, in my national role, there has been some progress. We've never seen the levels of commitment that has occurred from this government, but we know that that's not enough. We need to ensure that, that there's funding available, and that funding is reaching, our communities. It's not getting caught up in bureaucracy. It's not getting caught up in political organizations. That we need to ensure that money is reaching our community members on the ground, whether it be in urban settings or in First Nation and remote and isolated communities. So there has to be mechanisms to allow for, that opportunity to reach those who desperately need support, and to really put a huge focus on prevention, healing, and wellness, and to also take a global lens to the issues and the root causes of gender-based violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. There has to be a multi-pronged approach, to ensure that there's impact.
So then, is that still what needs to be done in your view? What would you make a priority here as we move forward?
I think for me, as an Indigenous woman, a priority for us, is to have our basic human rights met, because that's not happening right now. We have multiple priorities that need immediate attention. So it's difficult to say, we need secure housing, we need food security, we need economic opportunities, we need educational opportunities, we need access to quality healthcare, access to mental health services, access to addiction services. We have such great needs, so it's hard to supersede one need over another. That's why I really highlight that it has to be a wraparound approach, and it has to be Indigenous led, rooted in our Indigenous ways of knowing and being. We cannot, accept prescriptive approach from, colonial mechanisms, that have oppressed us previously.
Mm-hmm. And Hilda, this is all set against the current news of the 4 Indigenous women murdered in Winnipeg and the backdrop of what's happening in Prince George, British Columbia as well. And we hear so many stories all the time. Why do you think this keeps happening? I know you mentioned a few of the causes, but why do you think this keeps happening?
To be brutally honest, it's happening as a result of the misogyny and the patriarchy that exists in this country. And how our lives are devalued as Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. Not to knock my non-Indigenous sisters, but if we were white women, we would definitely not be in this type of situation. Yeah. I value all women equally, but there is inequity when it comes to government responses to the violence being experienced by Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. Mm-hmm. I think we need to call it what it is. It's racism. Racism is killing us. Racism is oppressing us. Racism is perpetuating the violence that we're experiencing.
And Hilda, as I just mentioned, we've heard a lot about the RCMP and the violence against Indigenous women and girls recently in Prince George. How does policing fit into what we're talking about here?
Well, policing is a weapon that is used by the Canadian state. We've seen it used against our people, when we look at the 60 Scoop Indian residential school, the child welfare system, and now when, Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people are seeking justice or seeking protection, it's not there. And they're perpetuating violence, and we're being violated by an agency that is supposed to protect us and that, we should trust, but that's not happening. We don't trust the police. We've seen, multiple incidents of not only one policing agency in this country, it's happening in multiple provinces and territories as well. So as an Indigenous woman, we don't trust the police.
Mm-hmm. So then how, I guess, on top of that, Hilda, how do we sort of change that narrative in a sense as well?
I think it's about creating accountability mechanisms, to ensure that there's Indigenous representation on those accountability mechanisms. And if we develop Indigenous police forces, there also has to be accountability mechanisms, for our safety and security as well. Not only do we experience violence outside of our communities, we're experiencing violence at alarming rates within our communities as well. This is why I highlight the critical need for supports, to be provided directly to our, First Nation communities as well for our safety and security.
Well, Hilda, we certainly appreciate the time. This is something that we will be watching as it unfolds and as it develops, and we certainly appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts and insights into this. So thank you very much, Miigwech.
Yep, thank you.
That is all we have for today's In Focus. Now, today's episode will be available as a podcast. You can listen and subscribe on aptnnews.ca/podcasts or find us on your favorite player. And if you missed any of our past episodes, you can find them and more on aptnnews.ca/infocus. I want to once again say thank you to all of our guests for joining us and to you as well for tuning in. Dennis Ward will be in this chair next week, taking a look at the first accomplishments for Indigenous people. I'm Daryl Stranger. Have a great afternoon.